All right, we're back. We're continuing with our faux lightning round here. um, uh, Working through some questions. Right now, I'm taking questions from Kristen, and she's commenting on chapter 2 of Berger's Media and Society book, Media Usage in the USA. And she writes, the textbook states, quote, 32% of American teens never read, and 50% of teens read sometimes, end quote. Media has taken priority, and reading has been put aside. If media influences teens so crucially, and teachers, parents, and school systems in charge of the curriculum are aware they are struggling with reading, why haven't they made some type of effort to combine the two in order to promote more reading? Let me pause there. There's more questions, but I want to say I think they have. And let's remember this. We are reading. When we're reading text, right? Text or text, we're reading. Like, we're engaging the practice of reading. What we're seeing, though, is that the information we're sharing and exchanging, reading, and moving through is shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. All right, so that should make sense for us, that the texts are smaller. The text is in, like, the books. We're not reading the long book. We're reading the microblog, right? We're reading the tweets. Maybe, like, the Instagram posts, the Snapchat faces. I don't know. We're funny faces, whatever that is, whatever's going on over there. But we are reading text, if that makes sense. It's just not always like that linguistic text, and it's definitely not those longer texts. And guess what? And several of you picked up on this one, this particular part of the book. So it clearly resonated. So it's important to talk about and tease out a little more. But let's make no mistake. Berger was writing something very, specific for that time of this version. This edition of this book. But I think continuously gathered data is supporting that in actuality, statistically, adults past college read less every year on average, right? So if you're still reading a lot, if you're reading more, you're not in the average. And in fact, if you're like, what do you call it, like returning to school or kind of completing a new degree or something like that, at a later point in time, you're a statistical anomaly, right? So you're ahead of the pack or separate from the pack in different ways, in special ways. But there's evidence suggests people read less the further, the more distance they have from those educational years. So that's a myth that we can debunk about young people. Same time, sort of that, bookstore literacy, if we want to call it that. I mean, that, bookstores, we know this because we know this. It's been on the decline, but it's because the print medium is being eclipsed by digital medium. And we are reading digitally online, but, and I have my own biases, right? So here is me talking about it and trying to be objective and recognize both sides of that. Hey, I appreciate books, and I love book people, and at the same time, there are times when I want to pick up a book and read, and there are times when I want to just screen some media, and these are different experiences, right? They have different aesthetic offerings for us. They mean different things to us, and what we read is different, right? So something intellectual is different from something that's a fiction. It's different from a children's story. It might be different from, a theological text, right? A kind of scripture of sorts. And so these different uses present, unique experiences. And that's why it can be difficult to lump it all together. One of the follow-up questions here is that students are able to utilize applications on their school furnished laptops, but not one idea to get the students interested in reading. Accelerated Reader, right? There are programs that are trying to stimulate reading interest in youth. I'm familiar with some young people going to school right now, relatively close to me, and there is an enormous reward system built into reading at a lot of our schools now. I don't know how in the know we are, where we're at in that process or stage, or who we have in our circles, but they have a huge reward system. They're still doing the book fairs, right? Not advocating the types of books they're selling at those fairs, or the distracting kinds of things that are sold at those fairs, but there are still efforts to promote literacy, and that is one of the enormous gaps in our country. That is one of those true, like, haves and have-nots. I mean, to steal Mark's popular phrases, literacy is important, but it transcends just reading a book, or knowing how to read a book is one thing. Understanding what the book means and is truly saying is an entirely different experience, right? And let's translate it to right now. What are we doing in this class? All right, it's one thing to sit down and just watch a show, right? Go to the movies. It's another thing to decipher, what is this text communicating? What is it communicating? Consciously versus unconsciously, overtly versus covertly? What is it communicating about the world around us? What is it communicating about the cultural context in which we live in which it was produced, right? Why does a film look different, sound different? Why do characters speak differently, behave differently in the 1960s, right? The free love era versus today, right? And why does that matter? Why does it matter to have that conversation? It's a rhetorical question. It's a trick question. It does matter. But do you know, not just that it matters, but why it matters? And it's the why that matters. It's the why that matters. It's the why that has us kind of having these assignments and engagements and sort of taking this pop culture fluff, right? This kind of casual throwaway stuff, and maybe like suggesting, is it elevated in a way? Is there more to say about this? And why? And why would that be important? I mean, these are individual questions that we can answer. It's not a singular answer that we're looking for. What we're looking for is developing the kinds of cognitive processes that allow us to kind of undertake those mental journeys, right? And to better understand how culture works. What do you think the problem is with teens lacking the desire to read? I mean, attention spans, right? And technology's retraining us. Let's not forget this. And this is not a teen thing. This is everybody thing. When we talk about people having shorter attention spans, notice I said people, this is not young people in school, right? This is not children and teens. This is everybody. Everybody. I can get around way older adults, and very few are kind of holding that candlestick conversation anymore, right? We've been retrained, hardwired by media and social media in particular, only in the last decade, to really think and see and scroll through the world differently. And in Western society especially, I mean, that's several of you have even commented on this idea of, walk into a coffee shop. There's a bunch of conversations going on, or are people kind of buying in and building culture, or is everybody just kind of screening, right? Like micro screening in their own little, pockets. The coffee shop historically was a place of sharing knowledge and information. This is where, before we had the beauty shop, this is where we get that term salon, the salon. All right, so in the Enlightenment period and in years before we really kind of went into the Enlightenment period, we're talking pre-industrial age, this salon was this kind of, coffee house, or maybe an ale house, but this place where we would congregate, they would forge community, and they would often build discussion. It could be about, civic topics, politics, life and the arts, and frequently they would be sharing literature, right? Whether it's pamphlets or serial novellas and short stories and stuff, maybe writing letters. You've heard of that term, like people of letters, letter writers. back when this wasn't just a craft, it was an intellectual hobby, right? It was just practicing communication, just like we log into our social media apps to practice communication today. It's different. What we're doing, it's different. The steps are different. It looks different, but it's still meeting a kind of need. It's satisfying a personal need. It could be satisfying a social need. All right, so hopefully we've tackled the nature of that question in a sufficient way, right? So responding to the Roberts text, Communication Theory, Millennial Popular Culture, Essays and Applications, from the editor's note. All right, introduction. Kristen, I believe, writes, first, was shocked when I read you're one of the authors of the book. Second, since theories change our perceptions, what theory has changed the perception you have about life or afterlife? Whoa, this is, man, what a pinball question here. So, yes, brief acknowledgement. That's fantastic. Hey, we're finding things, right? We're uncovering secrets. I was processing this question quite a bit, and I haven't got to the satisfactory single answer yet, right? Which is the problem with the great question, is if it sparks too much thought, how do you begin to break it down? But I don't want to escape this question. I want to confront it. In terms of a theory that has changed the perception about life or afterlife, I certainly have an upbringing where I was kind of brought up around narratives about, quote unquote, afterlife, or, I grew up in a relatively Judeo-Christian household, right? And so that was not necessarily foreign. Those sort of stories and histories and theological discussion, those things have been kind of, embedded or what you call encoded from a very early age. And so also, at the same time, I guess I should say, when I was younger, I did grow up in relatively smaller, more rural environments. And it took moving out and away from those and learning about theories, at the simultaneous crossroads of growing up in life, to continue to broaden and deepen my perceptions about reality, my understandings of other people groups and maybe demographics in certain ways, right? And ideologies and cultural values and so on. And that, not everyone can make that kind of claim. And I would say someone that benefited immensely from graduate school, where you're really forced to wade into the weeds of theory and method, and you get that firsthand exposure to a lot of academies, right? This kind of stuff. And it's probably important to pause there and say, well, I'll pause there and I'm going to move on. I lost my thought again. What is happening today? What is happening here? But several, let me give a couple of theoretical perspectives that have left a strong impact on me. I continue to reflect on what they mean and their values, and strengthen my ability to empathize with a broader array of concerns outside of my own, right? And so a couple that come to mind, not necessarily the ones I teach the most, not necessarily the ones I use the most, but maybe they're useful to me. Maybe they're most educational to me, right? Maybe they give me the most diverse breakaway from where maybe I was comfortable or accustomed to being, versus how I can better understand others and how the world works. And so some of these do derive from this tree or strand of what we call critical theories or cultural studies, right? This area. And so one that's potent, and I think there's a lot of critique, counter critique. There's room for dialogue. In other words, could be post-colonial theory, right? This idea that a lot of our values and the ways we see the world and practice life were kind of embedded over time by a very narrow and very specific array of kind of, you know, Northwestern European colonizers, right? and sort of the kind of the rules and the ways that they framed society impacted subsequent generations, and this idea of colonization, right? Kind of colonizing like area after area after area after area of the world leads us closer to what we refer to as cultural homogenization, right? Meaning we're less distinct, we're less different, we're more the same. And part of that process includes another term that's rich in cultural studies, assimilation, right? This idea that we assimilate other people groups and other cultures. That should ring true for us as in the United States, especially because we, you know, you've heard of that melting pot term, but others call it a more of a stew, if you will. And we have a lot of co-cultures within our, you know, mass culture. And the co-cultures often feel a tug or a need to have to assimilate, right? To adapt to our maybe like narrower way of practicing life in order to function at a certain level. And an example that comes to mind would be our various diverse Native American populations in the United States, and how they were kind of forced into a catch-22 of assimilation or kind of further marginalized, right? Marginalization, another term coming out of cultural studies. So we see how these various little blips of key terms and phrases, you know, there's that question that I've tackled in week 2 about why are we studying all these theories of communication? Well, who cares? Like, why is it important? And that's, I'm just spitballing here, but with this idea of, well, all these terms are interconnected. They're helping us understand and navigate the world better. But, you know, we absorb a lot, and sometimes that gets remixed. And I'm talking about culture. And yeah, there's a theorist that wrote an excellent book, Ariel Dorfman, something like How to Read Donald Duck. There's a couple of different books. The Emperor's New Clothes, or The Emperor's New Clothes. And it's a critique of how American popular culture sort of creates this umbrella effect over a lot of developing nations, right? I'm going to use an un-PC term to help us understand when I say developing nations, and that's more of a diplomatic term. It's referring to what people used to call like third world countries, right? Which is a kind of a demonizing term. But developing nations sort of receive a lot of social influence from stronger economies, but also from dominant cultures. And popular culture is a way that dominant cultures can practice what's referred to as soft power over those non-dominant cultures. Does that make sense? And so over time, we're using culture to kind of colonize these other areas, even if they're going to be their own distinct nation states, because we're moving toward a global economy, and you know, they're either going to stay in developmental mode or deteriorate, that's still a possibility, or assimilate in certain kinds of ways, right? And so, you know, I'm no master of colonialism or post-colonial theory, but it's very intriguing to me. In fact, let me draw a connection, because I'm already heading down that route. the Bond series actually has this kind of invisible thread of that is applicable to this example. And I'd planned to mention a couple other examples, but I'll table them for now, for another day, for another conversation, and just stick to this one case example of cultural studies and post-colonial theory. But the Bond series, right? It's about empowerment of the British Empire, which was the dominant superpower in the world, right? In the dawn, at the time of the dawn of America, they had the largest, widest imprint of colonies. When we think about the history of Australia, well, where they had their Aboriginal survivors, natives to the continent, and then there was the British Empire, and like this is where you have this influx of English-speaking, accented, right, kind of Euro-ethnic colonists down there. Well, same thing with South Africa, and many of those other African nations that had suddenly English as a second language. Well, it's because they were colonies. They were colonies of, they were British colonies, and there was a lot of control there, and there was control for mining purposes, and so on, things like that. Well, the United States is kind of birthed out of that kind of Western European tradition. We had colonies of our own. We were initially, a combination of colonies is what all these, old war lessons of the New World teach us, that the tensions between, Spain and France and Great Britain, and this birth of a new independent land. But I've also talked about causality in week 2, and for every cause there's an effect, and because there is this urge and this surge of people to the New World, right? The North American lands, there's an effect, right? More people coming over here require more goods and services. They need ways to produce a lot of things, and they need to produce from a lot of things. So there is this kind of movement west, this sort of acquisition of resources through various means, often diplomatic, sometimes militarily, right? That's an act of colonization in of itself. We're just claiming, hey, it's a claim, like, well, we're now a self-actualized nation. But then, the use of course, the underbelly, right? The Southern Gothic specter that haunts, United States history is that use of slave labor to help produce the goods and services that were allowing so many areas of industry to flourish or become, we call it, like, self-sufficient in certain ways, right? The nation. But anyway, so James Bond carries this legacy of, the British Empire was the superpower, right? You think about, your top 10 superpowers of all time, right? In the history of human civilization, and the British Empire is one of them, right? But they have been in decline. But there's always a formalism to British imperialism, right? They had certain, like, this is where we get this myth of Victorian principles and rules and ideals, tea time and 3-piece suits, right? Corsets and everything else. Not saying that only belongs to the to the UK, to the British, but James Bond kind of carries this formalism. And he, even this license to kill, right? A man that can creep across boundaries and borders, and he has all this privilege that he's able to execute these missions that go against other, maybe nation laws, and they supersede, for his people, right? At least they supersede these developing nations and their laws and boundaries, and there really is this kind of meta history in this hyper fictionalized, hyper fantasy type of world that's reminding us of certain aspects of human nature and human history. So that went in a spontaneous place that I wasn't expecting. And that definitely was not part of my prepared response at all. In fact, most of it just went in a new direction. But hopefully I've answered that question honestly and in a kind of authentic way that also is educational and contextual to what we're discussing. We'll take another break and we will pick this lecture series back up.